are some factors that draw us together, and what are some of those factors also that drive us apart. And one of the things we noticed was that it was the same things very often that attracted us to each other that now distract us in our marriage. Because we are drawn, at least in temperament, to marry persons who are opposite of what we are. So we hit what we call the after-marriage dip experience, which I suggest that every marriage in some way or another goes through to one degree or another. More exciting than even that, I think, is to think together for a little while now about what we can do, what are those helps to pull us out of the after-marriage dip, and those which can also help us all through marriage, very likely. So let me suggest some for you. First of all, I think we need to understand that we married the person we needed. That is, we were drawn to the person who has those traits which we ourselves lack, who can make up for that which we ourselves need. And so, if rightly used, these differences then can add richness to our relationship rather than cause difficulty and division in our relationship. So I tell couples, if you had it to do all over again, you would marry the same kind of person. Some years ago, Betty and I did a little book together called If We Were Starting Our Marriage Again. And after that book came out, we were invited to go across country on TV talk shows. We started one day in Pittsburgh, and then Cleveland, and Toledo, and Chicago. The next week we started in Houston, Texas, and we ended up down with the publisher at Nashville, Tennessee. Well, we knew that's a new experience for us, pretty much so at least. We talked over and said, you know, sometimes they try to get you in a corner so that it makes it exciting and ask you questions, you know. So we're just going to say we don't know if we don't and try to answer as best we know. Well, it's those secular kinds of settings, and you've watched them where they rush you on for 5 minutes and ask you questions, or 10 at the most, and then they rush you off again. And so we were going across from station to station like that. And I remember saying to Betty, you know, they may ask us questions that are hard for us, and maybe they'll not be very sympathetic to our position. But you know what we found in these very secular settings? That even these folks were very concerned about what is happening to the home today, what is happening to marriage. The interesting thing was, they told us again and again that they could not imagine anybody being married to the same woman for 40 years. You see. One time, after we'd been on stage, we had moved out back and were talking with, I believe, the cameraman, a tall fella, as I remember. And this is what he said. He said, "Crazy me. It's my 4th time around, and I married the same kind of woman every time." Well, of course he did. Of course he did. Why? That's exactly the woman he needed. Isn't it strange? He was drawn to those same characteristics time and time again, and here in a short time, we're so different, everything else. So he was ready to get out of it. 4 times around, he sees it today. In those few minutes, suddenly something hit him. Another thing that helps us a great deal, I think, is to remember the traits we admire. Shortly after marriage, we begin to zero in, if we don't watch it, on the negatives. And all of us have plenty. We begin to think of the faults, you see, which we have, and forget the good points for which we chose each other. And so I say we need to remember the traits which we admire. While teaching at the seminary years ago, I remember one day a lady from the community came. She threw down a Dear Abby column on my desk and said, "There, read that." I'd never met her before. I haven't met her since. It described, she said, exactly what my husband is like. So I read it. I wish I had kept it. Of But I remember some things it said. It described a husband who probably wasn't as loving as he ought to be. He wasn't too good a communicator, perhaps. He was a workaholic. These kinds of things, you know. And I said, well, your husband isn't here. You say this describes him? Yeah. I can't talk to him. But let me ask you several questions. First of all, would you say that your husband's faithful to you? Oh, yeah, she said, I don't have any problem with that. All right, I said, he's not messing around with some other woman. No, no, no. Secondly, I said, how do the kids like him? Oh, they like him pretty good. Okay. Is he a good provider for your family? Well, that's part of the problem, she said. He's all the time working, you see. I wish that I had kept a list of several more questions I had asked along that line. We talked a little longer, and I remember so well when she went to the door of my office, she stopped there, she hung her head for some time, and this is what she said. She said, am I ever glad you told me what's good about my husband? There she was. You see, zeroing in on the negatives. Many a wife would be glad for a faithful husband. Many a wife would be glad for a husband that makes it pretty good with the children, a good provider. Understand, if he had been there, we would need to talk about some things too. The workaholic kind of thing and so forth. But she began to see that maybe she had a husband that she needs to appreciate. I hope she caught that. So remember the traits you admire. I speak to couples in larger settings sometimes, person-to-person kind of things. Some time ago, a group invited me in for 4 Sunday nights. So we want you to come and talk to, and it was a sizable group of couples. I thought this would be a wonderful time to try something. I thought I'll ask these couples that every day this month, you jot down one thing each day that you appreciate about your spouse. Wouldn't that be an interesting experience? And so I came back to the second session, and one of the questions I asked was, well, how are you making out with jotting down things you appreciate about your spouse? Everything was silent for a little bit, and then one woman spoke up and said, I thought of one thing. No wonder they had trouble with their marriages, you know. They were, again, centering on the negatives rather than the positive. When I counsel young couples at times for marriage, one of the assignments, I have 10 outside assignments. I have a book for them to work through of 51 statements and the like. But one of the assignments I have, next time you come back, I want you to come and each of you have 10 things that you deeply admire about each other. That isn't difficult before marriage. They come back, we discuss them, and then I say, now frame them. Frame them. Hang them up someplace in the bathroom or the bedroom or the kitchen where you got to see them every day, because after marriage we're inclined to center on the negatives and forget the positives. Some time ago, there was a counselor in our group who, after I discussed this issue, she came and said, John, you're exactly right. She said, you know, after our marriage and our dip experience, the lowest point in our marriage, she said, I went back to my diary that I kept during our dating experience. And she said, I found that everything I had said about Gary is still true. But I was zeroing in on the negatives. Well, we can make that choice, of course, where we want to zero in. Now, the next thing I suggest is a big one. We gotta stop trying to change each other. Shortly after marriage, we kind of become creator all over again, and we want to make the other into our image. And if we could do it, we wouldn't like them. That's not why we chose them. But that's a great temptation. I talked to a man only last week, and I said there is only one person we can change. That's ourselves. We got to let the rest up to God. And as long as we're out there trying to change the other person, what happens is we begin to prop our feet against each other. If you're gunning to change me, the natural reaction is to prop my feet, you see. The way in which we change as husbands and wives, parents, children, other relationships, is when we feel loved and accepted. So there are all kinds of possibilities for change. I remember in a marriage retreat, we came to our last session together, and I asked the question, what have we learned together this past week? And a woman responded immediately with a lot of emotion. And she said, I guess what I've learned this week is that I got to stop trying to change Bill here. She said, I've worked for 25 years trying to change this guy, and it hasn't worked a bit. And I said, if you have learned that, you've learned something awfully important this week. There was Bill. We all liked Bill. He had a sense of humor. He was a likable fellow. And yet she was trying to make him over, trying to become creator again, make her into her own image. Quit trying to be creator. Let's just love and accept each other. Some time ago, a man after the honeymoon said to his bride, Dear, do you mind if I point out a few of your faults? This wise woman answered and said, absolutely not, dear. They're the very reason I didn't get a better husband. I don't think he proceeded very far. Number 4, we got to start talking. Now, we want to spend more time in communication, but I want to mention here that a key to all of this is our communication together, our understanding of each other. We learn to know each other by communicating. Communicating in our dating experience, courtship, we learn to know each other by sharing. And we only share to a certain level, I know that. We have so much more to learn. We marry thinking that now we can continue to communicate even at deeper and deeper levels. And the scripture says, to communicate, forget not. Often, after marriage, we forget that communication is still the key to a happy marriage. In another setting, in the discussion period, a man who had a number of businesses, he said, early in our marriage, I thought we had a pretty good marriage. But my wife would come to me sometimes and say, Dear, I have some things I ought to share with you. And he'd say, yeah, one of these days we have to take some time off. Then she'd come again and say, there's some things that are bothering me I'd like to talk about. And he'd say, one of these days we have to get some time and just take some time off. And then he said this. He said, one day I happened to get home at noon. And I had a note on the kitchen table. And it said, you'll find me in the bedroom. I've taken an overdose. I went to the bedroom. I got my wife in time to get her to the hospital to save her life. Here was this busy businessman taking off a week in that kind of marriage retreat. Well, it's sad if it has to come to that limit, but there are all kinds of levels to which many times that comes. Number 5, practice the little things that build love. I call it continuing the courtship. Do those little things that build love in the first place. In fact, as I promised young couples, when I counsel them for marriage, one of the last sessions, I say, now I want to make a guarantee to you. I guarantee that your marriage will go on gloriously if you continue to practice 50% of the little niceties, the little gifts, the little words of love, the little acts of love that you practice before marriage. So much of the time you have a lot of love or these expressions before marriage and they drop off after marriage. And I say, you practice 50% and your marriage will go on gloriously. Reports of an insurance company survey, it said that the husband who kisses his wife each morning before he goes to work will probably live 5 years longer, earn 20% more money, lose 20% more sick days, and be involved in fewer automobile accidents than the man who doesn't kiss his wife each morning. Now, Betty heard me use that some time ago, and one of the next days I was rushing out of the house, and she came running after me. And I said, Betty, what do you want? She said, I want you to live longer. To practice the little things. A woman came to me some time ago. She couldn't see hardly anything anymore in her husband that she really appreciated. And finally, I was sort of bogged down too and know what to say to her. I said, do you know of anything that your husband really appreciates? She thought a little while and she said, yeah, I think he likes chocolate cake. I say, you go home and make him a chocolate cake. See what happens. Well, I talked to her sometime later, and she's the one who said, you know, that advice which you gave me that day to start doing the things I know my husband appreciates is better advice than I've gotten from numerous counselors. She began to doing the little things that we know we appreciate. Maybe you heard the story of the woman who came to the counselor and said that not only does she want a divorce, but she wants to really hurt her husband in the whole experience. And the counselor said, you really want to hurt him? She said, I really do. He said, I have exactly what you can do. For the next month, butter him up. Do everything you know that he may appreciate, and just when he begins to warm up a little bit, hit him with a divorce. You really hurt him. Well, that man that counselor didn't see this couple for some time, and finally saw this woman one day. He said, well, did you go through with the divorce? She said, no, we're deeply in love. Doing the little things that build love. We forget them so easy. Keep practicing the little things that we know we appreciate together. Well, another thing that's necessary if we're going to grow in love together is time. Take time. The fact is, I've said it hundreds and hundreds of times to the mother-father relationship, husband-wife, parent-child. Love is spelled T-I-M-E. It's the way you spell love. If you don't have time for each other, you can't grow in love. I lived for 19 years right next to university campus, taught there some. And one of the things that impressed me was the time these kids spent with each other. They sit in the library together, they walk the dining room together, they sit together in class, and then I'm told when they get back to their rooms, they call each other up, and one of the things they complain about is we don't have enough time together. And then some of them get married, you see, then after marriage, their complaint is they don't have time for each other, or they don't take the time. At a Valentine banquet some time ago, I told a story that said come out of Kansas. A very severe windstorm came across the country one night, and it took the roof right off a certain house, and it lifted the husband and his wife who were sleeping in bed right up and dropped them down gently in the barnyard. The man heard his wife whimpering, crying, and tried to comfort her and say, now don't worry, we'll get this thing straightened out, don't be sad. And she said, well, I'm not sad. But she said, I'm glad. It's the first time we've been out together in 20 years. Well, we need a covenant of time. A covenant of time. I've stressed, and I stress it with all kinds of groups, ministers and the like as well, it's God, family, work. And when any one of those three gets out of that order, all three are in trouble, you see. God, family, work. Well, doing things together also builds a sense of oneness in our relationships together. While in Virginia years ago, a certain pastor would call me occasionally. He had a little distance from where I lived, but he'd say, "John, I have somebody I'd like you to talk to." He'd drive the distance. Sometimes he brought a couple, sometimes he brought a young person. And one day, this wonderful pastor, I thought of him that way, called me and said, "John, I need your help again, and this time it's me." They came in 2 cars, but I had no idea at all they're already separated. They came into my office, and she began to talk. I had never met her before, but this is how she began. He called this meeting, let him talk. But she talked for the next hour. And he needed to hear what she was saying. She said things like this. Well, she said some very hard things. She said, "I never want to see his dirty face again." She said things like that. But she said, "You know, there I go even into the church. He's writing, he's reading, and I'm trying to talk to him, and I say, 'Stop that reading, stop that writing.' And he says, 'I'm listening.'" And I said, "Pastor, would you treat any of your parishioners like that?" "No." "Then why do you treat the woman you love like that?" "We talked the next hour like that." Well, they made another appointment, and that following week, she called me one evening and she said, "You know, last evening we had a date together, and it went pretty good." Sometime later, I had a note on my door at the house, said, "We'll not be able to make that next appointment. We're going together," and they told me where they're going for the weekend. While they were going, they used Ed Wheat's formula. I call it the magic formula. It's a good one to remember. The best formula. BEST. Bless each other in some way every day. Edify each other in some way every day, or encourage. Share with each other every day, and touch each other every day. That couple used that formula in that weekend together. And I wish you could have met them when they came back from a weekend like that. We invited them a little later to our house for a meal, and they came saying we could hardly wait to get here to tell you what happened from way back there when we were at the low until what has happened today in our marriage. This pastor told me, "You know, I couldn't preach on marriage because our marriage was not in any shape or itself. I couldn't counsel married couples. And for the first time in my ministry," he said, "I feel I have something to say to married couples." Well, Charlie Shedd talks about the covenant of time. He divides it in 2 sections, he and his wife. He says that we commit ourselves to 15 minutes a day to talk about what's going on inside Martha and Charlie. And then we have the commitment to go out at least once a week and spend time together, maybe eating out, doing something where we're communicating, where he talks about communicating from the subterranean recesses of the soul, you know, down deep, what's going on inside. Beware of the robbers, those things which steal valuable time. One of those robbers is when the husband and wife are working all the time and they don't have time together. TV is a robber. I see where there's a no TV week coming up somewhere along the line. I think great idea. Just communicate again between persons. Golf dates can be robbers if you don't watch out. Sports can be big robbers. Breakfast meetings, you can go on and on. We need to sift these out and notice where the robbers are. Before marriage, we plan to do things together. And so we need to be diligent because love is spelled T-I-M-E. If we don't have time for each other, we cannot grow in love. And when we think of our children will not feel our love unless also they feel that we have time for them in our relationships together. Those are a few suggestions I leave with you now, as you think of those things which help us not only when we start our marriage together or to pull out of that first dip which we talked about, but it seems to me are pretty important all the way through, and the ups and downs which every marriage will go through.